Hey folks, this is Cindy. Thanks so much for stopping by. In today's video, I will be sharing a comparison of Copic sketch markers and the Spectrum Noir markers from the coloring system line. Spectrum Noir has other lines of markers available, but I chose the color system line because it seems to be the most popular in the card making industry, and it's the one I get the most questions about. Copic also has other markers available, but I am going to share the Copic sketch with you today because this is the one I primarily use. Also, if you're interested in hearing more about these markers when coloring larger images, such as what I did here with the Tiddly Inks Camellia digital stamp, as well as my thoughts on colored pencils over both brands, consider becoming a patron over on my Patreon. I will have that link down below if you're interested in hearing about that. Okay, so I purchased 2 6-packs in the Spectrum Noir coloring system line. I got the pink pack and the green pack, and I did match up Copic colors to those, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But first, let's talk about the more obvious physical characteristics between these two markers. So Copic is an oval barrel. It's double-ended, just like the Spectrum Noir. On one end, on the gray end, you have a brush tip that comes standard on the Copic sketch marker. You don't have to buy anything separate in order to get this feature. You can purchase them to replace them, but again, I'll talk about that more here in a minute. And then on the other end, the lighter gray end, is the chisel nib. Again, this is standard to the Copic sketch marker. Okay, so the Spectrum Noir marker is hexagonal in shape, which is larger than the Copic sketch marker. And to me, this doesn't feel as comfortable or as natural, but to be fair, it could just simply be because I'm not used to the shape of it. The markers in the coloring system line are double-ended, just like the Copic sketch. However, it comes standard with a bullet nib on one side. That is the dark gray end right here. And then on the other side is the chisel tip. So the coloring system line does not come standard with a brush nib like the Copic sketch does. You actually have to purchase those brush nibs separately, and we'll get to more of that here in a minute. Okay, so both of these markers have colored samples on both ends of the markers at the tip of the cap. So Copic has its own coloring system, Spectrum Noir has its own coloring system, and I'm not going to get into that too much here because I really feel like that's a whole other topic by itself. I am going to show you the difference between these two chisel nibs here. The Copic sketch is much smaller than the Spectrum Noir. I personally don't ever use my chisel nibs, so I don't think that that's a really big deal to me. However, there are plenty of techniques and uses out there for chisel nibs, so that might be something that you need to take into consideration. Now, there is an obvious difference between a bullet nib and a brush nib, but I did want to show you right out of the gate, if you purchased both of these markers side by side, what you would be looking at. That bullet nib is just this itty bitty little thing, and then especially compared to the Copic super brush nib that I keep on all of my Copics. Now, if you're purchasing the Spectrum Noir markers, you have to buy them in sets. You cannot buy them in open stock like you can with the Copic sketch markers. There are 12 6-packs available and 6 24-packs available. So there's 216 markers in the Spectrum Noir coloring system line. There's 358 in the Copic sketch line. So when you buy a 6-pack of the Spectrum Noir markers, they are broken down into their own color groups. So this is pink. There are 3 cool pinks and 3 warm pinks. In today's video, I'm sharing with you the warm pinks. Over on Patreon, I have the cool pinks. So there is quite a bit of difference between both of these groups. Also, if you want the colorless blender, you actually have to buy the essentials pack to get the colorless blender for Spectrum Noir. For Copic, you can buy that open stock. There's also some pretty major differences between refills. They are both refillable. However, the Copic various ink is 25 cc's or 25 milliliters, and the Spectrum Noir is 35 milliliters or 35 cc's. There are also some pretty big differences on how you fill these up. The Copic Various ink bottle is really easy to open. You just twist off that cap and you're good to go. You can feel it actually twist off, and you can feel when it twists on really nice, and I really enjoy that. You pull out that chisel nib with the Copic tweezers, you fill it up, make sure that you weigh it so that you have the right amount in there. Put that chisel nib back in, put your cap back on, you're good to go. Now take a note that I just put that cap back on that Various ink refill bottle, because you're going to see what I'm talking about here in just a moment. Now with the Spectrum Noir, it actually comes in this box. It has a glass bottle and it has a dropper in the package. Now I'm not going to refill this marker because I've never used it. And the only reason why I bought this refill was for this video in particular. Now here is one of the things that I dislike about this. Number one, I'm thinking about storage space on these refill bottles. I don't like the shape of these bottles. I also do not like having to get this open. Now I'm going to compare opening that Spectrum Noir refill compared to this Various ink refill. Huge difference for me. I definitely prefer the Various ink refill over this. Now I'm going to take this cap off. It was kind of tricky to get the cap off. It could be that it's new. However, it was a little tricky to get the cap off. I do have problems with my hands swelling up and getting sore, so this is something that I personally think of. I take the dropper, I put it in there, I pick up some of that liquid. Now my question is, if there is solvent in this ink and it dries in this dropper over time, what's going to happen to that? And my other question is, what am I supposed to do with this dropper in the meantime? Now, watch this puddle underneath this refill bottle. I didn't get that cap back on there all the way. It cross-threaded and I couldn't tell, and I had a huge mess. So after I got that cleaned up, which I had to do with some alcohol swabs, I noticed something else. So now the barrel on my Spectrum Noir marker, where the grippy part is, it's sticky. And I'm almost certain that I got all of the refill off it. However, I don't like the fact that it is now sticky. I did also get it on my Copic sketch marker, and I cleaned that off without a problem, and it's not sticky at all. Okay, so the thing about alcohol markers is there's a solvent in them, and over time, taking that cap on and putting it back on, that ink has a tendency to build up inside that marker. So you need it to keep those caps good and clean, because it can ruin your nibs. Now, I know that this is a thing with Copic. I don't know if it's a thing with Spectrum Noir. Just make sure that you're keeping those caps nice and clean, and then you don't have a problem. However, should you need to replace the nibs on them, these are the Spectrum Noir brush nibs. So this is going to replace the chisel end of the marker. So you're still going to keep your bullet nib. You will no longer have a chisel nib. For Copic, this is the super brush nib. It just replaces the brush end of your marker. You get to keep your chisel nib. Not a big deal. Both packages tell you which end of the marker that these are supposed to go on, which is really handy dandy in case you have any questions or if you've never done this before. Now we're going to take a look at replacing this nib here on the Spectrum Noir marker. The first thing is, this is a blister pack, and I was honestly legitimately trying to get this open by myself, and I could not do it. Just like with the refill, I had to get a pair of scissors and cut that open, and even then I felt like I needed to annihilate the whole thing in order to get it open. It's probably not that big of a deal for most folks. Personally, I can't stand this kind of thing because I do have problems with my hands and my fingers, and I hate having to deal with that kind of thing. With the Copic, it comes in this little zipper pouch, super duper easy to get out and put down there on my work surface. Easy peasy, good to go. Now I'm going to show you the difference between the two of these. Overall, they're pretty similar. The differences are just going to be on how they need to accommodate each of these markers. So the more yellow one there up at the top, that would have Spectrum Noir. The more white one on the top now is the Copic. I don't know what the quality difference is between these two nibs. Honestly, I don't know that it matters 100%. percent, and it definitely doesn't matter, I suppose, for the sake of this video. All right, so let's start taking a look at how these markers work. And while this comparison is not at all about paper, I am going to do a test on the Spectrum Noir Ultra White Smooth cardstock and Express It blending card. Express It is for Copic, obviously Spectrum Noir is for Spectrum Noir, and I wanted to give both of these markers equal advantage on good quality paper. So I'm going to do one on each of those so you guys can really see how they perform. And I'm going to start here with that chisel nib. Again, look how much fatter that is, and I'm curious if that makes a huge difference. Now, while I don't use it a whole lot, there are definitely techniques out there that you can use that chisel in for. The first thing I'm looking at here with this Copic is how easy it went down. I'm holding it right there at that angle, and it was super duper easy. For some reason, I lost the footage with the Spectrum Noir. However, it was just as easy, and I really don't see a difference in the line width in that. So I think they're both pretty much equal. Now, the second one, I'm going to use the brush tip on the Copic, and this flick stroke, that's exactly what I do on 90% of my projects. So this is what I'm familiar with, and this is what I expect to see. I expect it to get to me at that fat base and that very fine point, so I can have the best blending possible. There's a lot of factors that go into blending, but the flick stroke and how you do the flick stroke and what shape it is plays a huge factor in coloring and in blending. So if I were just to buy the Spectrum Noir marker, I would have this bullet nib on it. It's obviously a lot thinner than that brush nib, and I can't get the flick stroke on this that I can with a Copic marker. Those ends, the very tips of those flicks, end up a little bit fatter. In fact, they're the same width as what my base is when I initially go down for that flick stroke. So I could definitely see where there would be an issue with that. Now, I know that you can take a different approach when coloring with Spectrum Noir that would alleviate some of that problem, and I will talk about that here shortly. Now, with saturation, what I'm looking for here is I'm layering each stroke over the top of the last one. Both of these markers are claimed to be transparent, so I want to see, by layering that color over the top of the previous stroke, how much that builds up if you have any of those lines. Now, I am giving these some advantage because I am using specialty paper, and that's going to help a bunch. I really didn't see a difference in either one of them, regardless of paper and regardless of marker. It seems to me that you have a little bit of opportunity there to layer that color before the color itself becomes oversaturated and darkens as you build up that color. And that's actually a good thing. You don't want to take like a Copic Y00 and you're shooting for that super duper light color, and then you start layering Y00 over Y00, and then you start ending up with Y05 at some point. So that's kind of something to look at as well. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to test out a Copic multiliner on both the Spectrum Noir and the Copic as well, and I want to see if there's any smearing. I am using a darker color, so that could make a difference. Maybe a lighter color, you would see a little bit of smearing. Copic multiliners are not supposed to smear at all. That being said, depending on what kind of paper you're using, it can, and I've seen it happen with lighter colors. I did not see it with this one at all, with both the Copic and the Spectrum Noir. So that was a bonus for both of them. At this point, the only thing the Spectrum Noir has going against it is the refills and the size of the marker itself. I really am not enjoying the size of this at all. I did all of this testing before I did any coloring in the hopes that I would kind of get used to it a little bit more before I started coloring, and I just couldn't. I couldn't do that at all. Now, the next thing we're going to take a look at here is how these colors shift once they start to dry back. Copic is just a teensy bit lighter when you first put it down, but it does not dry back too much. The color does not shift at all. However, the Spectrum Noir does. Look how much brighter and more vibrant this pink is, and then once it starts to dry back, it definitely picks up a lot more purple. This would be another thing I would say has Spectrum Noir has going against it. I want almost a true color, as true as I can get, coming right out of that marker from the get-go. I don't like that the color shifted. If I were working on a project, it would be really important to me that the color would change over time. That could definitely affect your overall project, I would think. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is the color comparison within these two lines. So the Spectrum Noirs are sold in sets, so you can guarantee that the colors that you're getting in the packages are going to work. Again, there's a cool combination of colors and a warm combination of colors, and they're going to work with one another, guaranteed. Now, I swatched out the Copics in the pink and the green, and I know that I said earlier I only got 2 packages. That's not true. I got 3. I got blue, and I didn't deal with that one at all. But I did swatch out colors as close as I could possibly get with Copic compared to the Spectrum Noir, and they didn't necessarily want to be friends with one another. And you're going to see more of what I'm talking about here in just a moment. Now, this is not a deal breaker for me. I got to be perfectly honest, folks. I would not buy another line of markers just to get that blending trio. I would find either a different color, or I would play around with the colors I had to see if I could get those to work first. Now, just because I got a really close match on these today and they didn't necessarily work well together does not mean that I could give up on that color scheme altogether. Now, what's interesting is the colors I swatched for that cooler pink there on the top. In Copic, those worked pretty well together. The ones down here, down below with the warmer Copics, those did not work out so well. So yes, you can find Copics that will work, that are almost the same color as the Spectrum Noir. Yes, sometimes it will work, sometimes it won't work, but that doesn't, again, it's not a deal breaker, and that doesn't mean that you can't figure out a way to make it work. All right, so next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to color this image. It's by Tiddly Inks. This is the Camellia digital stamp. I have this printed out pretty small here. I do also have it printed out much larger over on Patreon. That is printed out on Express It blending cards, so you can check that out. This one is printed out on Spectrum Noir cardstock. I wanted to give you guys a really good head-to-head comparison on these cardstocks and how well they work, and I was actually really pleased with both of them. However, I will talk more about that in a future video, so do stay tuned for that. So this is the Copic in RV29, R81, and RV11. This is going to be the close match to the Spectrum Noir warm markers. That would be the DR3, the PP5, and the PP3. Now, this is an excellent example of how these are close match, but they're just not going to work. They're not. This Camellia is going to look like a train wreck when it's done. At the end of the day, these colors in no Copic universe ever are they meant to work together. And there are some times with some Copics, there are some things that you can do that will kind of help make things a little bit easier when you're trying to get a really tough blend to work. And I'm actually going to show you an example of that here in just a moment. Overall, ideally, what you want is you want those Copic markers to be friends, even if they're not a part of the same color combination. I use Copics all the time that are not a part of a traditional blending trio, and they work great. So there are quite a few times, quite often, that you can use Copic markers that are not a part of the same blending trio and be just fine with it. In fact, the flower that I color over on Patreon, I do exactly that. I use an RV09, an RV06, and an RV63. Those are not a part of the same blending trio, but they still work out. With Spectrum Noir, it is guaranteed that it's going to work out. Now, There is a different approach that I found I had to take with the Spectrum Noir to get it to work a little bit better than what I'm typically used to with a Copic marker, and that's fine. I'll talk about that more here in just a moment. Now, here's one technique that sometimes you can do with Copic markers that will kind of help get things to work just a wee bit better. So I'm saturating the paper with my lightest marker first. I'm getting that paper nice and wet. So when I put this RV29 in there, it automatically starts moving within the fibers of the paper because it's mixing with that RV11. So then I'll bring in my R81 and I'm going to go right over the top of that RV29. It's already wet because it has the RV11 underneath it to kind of help move it. And then I'm going to go back over it again with my RV11. And you kind of can see just a tiny, tiny bit where I did get, quote, a little bit better blending on this. Blending would be a relative term because there's not a smooth transition between the three colors, but I could see where the lines or my strokes from that RV29 are diffused a little bit as opposed to being really harsh and stark like my previous petals. Now, I briefly mentioned how paper can make a big difference in circumstances like this, and it absolutely can. I don't think that this had anything to do with the Spectrum Noir paper at all. This is actually a pretty decent paper. I was happy with that overall. At the end of the day, these markers are just never ever going to get along. They're going to be bickering siblings until the day they died. But I wanted to give you this example anyways because, yes, sometimes it works out, sometimes not so much. So, unfriendly blending trios aside, one thing that I would like to note, regardless of what brand you're using, especially with alcohol markers, is if you work too far ahead on your project and you allow those inks time to dry before you move on to your next layer, you're going to have a harder time with blending. It absolutely does not matter which brand that you're using. By nature, that alcohol evaporates. And once it starts evaporating, it doesn't want to budge. It doesn't mean that it can't. It just means that you're going to have to put in a little bit more elbow grease. So that is also something to keep in mind. Now, I did work ahead on these. This image is tiny. It is super duper tiny. So I knew that it wasn't going to dry back too far. I knew that that wasn't going to be a problem. With this flower in particular, these are just horrible colors to work together. So it doesn't matter. Anything I do up to this point is going to be in vain. All right, so now I'm going to show you what the Spectrum Noir colors look like. I have replaced the bullet nib in this with the brush tip nib, and I'm also going to talk about how I feel about the Spectrum Noir brush nib as I'm coloring along here. This is the Spectrum Noir in the DR3. This would be your darkest shade color that's in the warm blending trio. This is actually a really gorgeous color going down. Again, I'm working ahead on this because this is a small enough image. I'm feeling fairly confident that I'm going to be okay with it. And I'm also taking the same exact approach that I would with my Copic marker. Again, I do flicking motions 90% of the time. So this is what I want to do. This is what feels more efficient to me. And this is how I think I should be getting a better blend. I don't like the size of this marker itself. I feel like I'm holding a log in my hand. I don't care for that too much. And the other thing that I really am not enjoying here is the nib. I do not like this nib. I think that it is too fat. It is a little bit wider there at the tip than what a Copic is, and I feel like I have no control over it whatsoever. In fact, if you look at the photos over on my blog, you can see that this one is a lot messier than what the other flower was, even though the colors were so bad on the other flower. Just those fine thin lines up against each of those petals, trying to keep those clean with this marker was just not fun for me at all. I did not care for that. And I didn't like that. I knew I was going to have to take a different approach with these. I would rather save the time while coloring than waste it at all. So what I'm doing here is I'm putting down this DR3, and then I go in with the PP5, just like I would with my mid color on my Copic, and then I finish that off with my lightest color. Every time I feel like I have to come back in with my mid tone and fix that just a little bit, and then touch it off one more time with that PP3. Now, it could very well be that I'm just absolutely doing this wrong. It could be that. But this is what I'm accustomed to, and I like knowing that I can save my time with my Copics. I like knowing that it is an option if I need to go back in and adjust something, not something that I have to do on every single part of that image. My projects are generally time intensive as it is, so little things like that kind of always stick out in the back of my mind. I think about them all the time. So overall, while I enjoyed these colors, they were very pretty, I did not like the process of doing it. And also, again, take note right here. You can see those bottom 3 petals that I just did. You can see huge difference with the color drying back and changing and shifting from the ones that are in the back. Again, that's not something I care for. So I'm going to try a different approach here, just like I did on the other ones. I saturated the cardstock with my lightest color. Now I'm going to go in with my darker color. This is the DR3, and I'm going to add that where I need it. These flowers are not meant to look pretty or realistic. These are not going to be gifts at any point. So I'm just kind of slapping down color here. I don't really care too much where or how much shade I have or highlight or anything like that. I am just simply demonstrating. Now, I did notice a little bit of a difference on this as I did with the Copic version, where by laying down that lighter color and then going in with my darker colors, it clearly saturated the paper enough that by the time I got that darker color in there, it already started to move it. Now, for these last couple petals, I am going to try this with the bullet nib. So I cannot flick out with this like I did with the brush nib. So I'm just going in these very tight circular motions until I get the color where I want it. Then I'm coming in with my mid color, which is the PP5. I'm going right over the top of that darker DR3, and I'm coming out in those tight circular motions right over the top of it. It's almost bordering on scrubbing, but not quite. And then I'm going to finish this off with the PP3. Now, one thing I can say for that bullet nib is it is small enough. It really gets you those tight, finer details and lines. However, I would like an all-purpose nib, and I just don't think that a bullet nib will do that for you. However, you can definitely see a difference on those bottom 3 petals than from the rest of that flower by simply changing my technique. Is this enough for me to want to buy a full line of Spectrum Noir markers? No. At the end of the day, I absolutely feel I'm getting the same thing out of my Copics, if not more, than what I would with Spectrum Noir. Now, before I get to the one thing that I know folks are waiting for me to talk about, I'm going to show you how to change out these Spectrum Noir nibs real quick. It's just as easy as a Copic. In fact, I have some Copic tweezers there. I'm pulling that chisel tip out of there, throwing that in the garbage, putting the new tip in there, and I'm just going to lay this here on my work surface. That ink will wick out to the tips of the markers on their own. In fact, you're going to get a good shot of that here in just a moment as they sit there. If you want, you can put those caps on and put them upside down so it drains a little bit faster, but either way, it's going to work. And I found that it was just as easy as replacing a nib on a Copic marker. So just to be clear, at this point, I have a brush nib and a bullet nib left on the Spectrum Noir. I do not have a chisel nib. Okay, so these are the Spectrum Noir color samples. The one on the right is the warm blending trio. The one on the left is the cool blending trio. There is a surprising difference between the two blending trios that you get in that 6-pack. Here are the color samples for Copic on the left-hand side, Spectrum Noir on the right-hand side. I did do the colored pencil work on these, and I do talk more about that over on Patreon. All right, so for the one thing that I know that everybody's been waiting for me to talk about, and that is cost. The cost of Spectrum Noir versus Copic is pretty substantial, and it would take more time than what I have in this video to discuss it here. However, check out the link below to my blog. I go into much more in-depth information and comparison on that topic over there. And that is it, folks. We are done. We are good to go. I hope you enjoyed my project today. If you did, hit that like button and share it with your friends. Also, be sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and tap that bell next to the subscribe button so you can receive all of my notifications. Thanks again so much for stopping by. Until next time.